Welcome again to this meeting organized by Israel for Fred. We are the largest membership organization in Europe which is non-religious and non-partisan. But we strongly support the Jewish people's right to their homeland in Israel. And we are really happy today to be joined by Brigadier General Amir Avivi, who is the founder and leader of Habithonistim.
Protectors of Israel in English.
Yeah, like he's saying, the name means Defenders of Israel. And it's a new organization consisting of Israeli elite officers and other leaders who supports to apply Israeli sovereignty of parts of Judea and Samaria. Avivi has been a high-ranking officer in the IDF, and he will explain more. And Amir, without any further delays, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. It's an honor and a pleasure to have the chance to speak to you. I tell you a bit about myself. I was born in Jerusalem. From my father's family, my family has been living in Jerusalem for 15 generations. From my mother's side, I'm first generation in Israel. My mother's family came from Bulgaria just after the Holocaust, also to Jerusalem. I spent most of my youth outside Israel. My father was an esteemed diplomat, and spent 15 years of my early life in different countries. I lived 5 years in Italy and 3 years in Africa and Ivory Coast, and 5.5 years in South America. And overall, I spent in Israel only 3 years, between 13 and 16. I graduated from a British high school in Rome. And at the age of 18, I came back to Israel. I joined the military and found myself in a 30-year career from a simple soldier all the way to becoming a general. I had many roles. I will mention maybe just a few. I was aide-de-camp of the General Chief of Staff, Bogie Yaalon. I mentioned this because this gave me a very broad perspective of how decision-making is done on the high level from the Prime Minister, Cabinet, Minister of Defense, and so on. I was a brigade commander on the Egyptian border and the deputy division commander of the Gaza Strip. I'm a combat engineer, so I also commanded the battalion and the School of Combat Engineers. And in my last position, I was in charge of all the auditing of the all Israeli establishment on behalf of the Ministry of Defense. So I audited the army overall, all the IDF. I audited the Ministry of Defense and the military industries. So also it was a place where I had a very meaningful and large perspective on what's going on in Israel and around us, and understanding on the high level. I retired 3 years ago. In these 3 years, I've been dealing a lot with the policy and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And one of the things that I felt all these years is that the voice of many commanders, officers, generals that believe in classic Zionistic values, believe in how important is the Jewish state, believe that we need to defend ourselves by ourselves, this voice was not heard. In the last 20 years, we have seen organizations of left-wing generals that call for retreats, that treat Judea and Samaria as if it is Palestinian land, that believe that international forces can replace the IDF, and that peace accords are some kind of security against threats. And I felt that there was a need to hear a different voice, a classic Zionistic, nationalistic Jewish voice. So I established the Habithonistim movement. Habithonistim is a slang. And the reason why I chose a slang word, which means like the security experts in Hebrew, is because I wanted not to build a place only for research and high-level papers and so on, because there are many think tanks in Israel and in other places, but nobody speaks to the public, and nobody deals on everyday work with the representatives in the Knesset and in the government. And I felt that the voice needs to be to the general public, to the public outside of Israel. So I decided not only to establish an organization, but to establish a movement. And sometimes, you know, everything is about timing. And when I decided to establish this movement, the talk about Trump's plan and applying sovereignty in Judea and Samaria began. And this gave us a lot of energy, and within a very short time, hundreds of officers started joining the movement. And by now, after, I would say, six months, 1,200 high-ranking officers, commanders, and warriors joined the Habithonistim movement. And it's growing every day. Every day, more and more people are joining. We are also building now a young generation movement underneath our movement. Just after this talk, I have a talk with a big group of the New Yemin party. And this last Saturday, I talked to another big young group of another party, and they all want to join and they all want to be involved because people are looking for values. People want a vision. And I think that we are providing this. I think in Israel, you know, people have a very high esteem of commanders and generals, and this is an opportunity and a responsibility, I would say, to show leadership and to set an example and to apply the right values. And people want values, want to go back to the core Zionistic values and reconnect to the very reason why the Jewish people have returned to their homeland. And this is what we're talking about. So this is a bit giving you an oversight, and I would like to start by talking about what's going on in the region and why it's happening. So of course, you know that the main thing that people are talking in these last few days, it's the upcoming peace accord between Israel and the United Emirates. I have been talking about that for like 5 or 6 years. And I want to explain why this is happening, what is the meaning of all this, and how does it affect the issue of sovereignty and what will happen next. So basically, the Middle East has undergone huge changes in the last 8 years. We see all the revolutions, what was called the Arab Spring and so on. But one of the people that affected the most what is happening now is President Obama. President Obama, when he was elected, made a dramatic decision to shift his alliance from an alliance between the United States and the Sunni Arab world, which means Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and so on, Egypt, to a new alliance with the Iranians. Now, how could he decide such a thing? What happened that made him even be able to consider such a change after so many years? The reason is simple. America has been relying for many decades on the Sunni Arab world oil. We saw America as a state that doesn't like to go to war, going to war in Kuwait in order to liberate Kuwait from the Iraqis because they had huge interest regarding oil. And they were willing to go twice to war. First, the first war, Iraqi war, and the second Iraqi war. That's how important this region was for them. But then, after years in the United States, they started developing new technologies of how to produce or extract oil from the ground. And in the last 10 years, America has reached a point where they are producing huge amounts of oil. The United States today is the biggest exporter in the world of oil. And only a few years ago, they had a law that doesn't enable them to export. In Obama's time, they changed the law in the Congress. They started exporting oil. And this very moment, the Middle East, from being a place that America depends on, now is a place that lost pretty much its importance in this sense. So Obama looked at the Middle East. He said, okay, I think that Iran is a much more serious state than all these Emirates and Saudi Arabia and so on. They're on the verge of nuclear weapons. They seem serious guys. Let's do business with them. So basically, he stabbed the Sunni Arab world in the back. He sided with Iran. He started giving them a lot of money, signing a really ridiculous nuclear agreement that basically says that in 15 years, Iran will be nuclear. And incited a huge war all over the Middle East, with the Sunni Arab world paying a very, very high price. While all this is happening, Prime Minister Netanyahu goes to the Congress and Senate, flies to America, and openly attacks Obama on American land. He speaks to the Congress and says, this is a terrible deal with Iran. We Israelis, if we need to, we will attack Iran ourselves. And he said something very important that people didn't really notice at the time. He said, I'm not representing only Israel here as Prime Minister of Israel. I am here to represent also the Sunni Arab world. And at that very moment, Israel became the hope of the Sunni Arab world. They understand that they cannot trust the Americans. They understand that if in America there will be a change of a party and the Democrats win, which actually might happen, once again, the Americans will side with the Iranians. Once again, they will stab them in the back. And this time, when this happens, they won't survive. They might actually be overthrown by the Iranians. So it's the first time in history that we have a real interest, a real one, between Israel and the Sunni Arab world in order to create a coalition against the Iranians. But it's funny, but it's also to create a coalition against the Europeans who will also want to side with the Iranians. And maybe it's creating a coalition against the United States with a democratic president who also wants to side with the Iranians. So basically, the Western world is pushing the Sunni Arab world to Israel's hands. And since the elections are in November, and nobody knows what the outcome will be, all these Sunni Arab worlds are trying very fast to make peace agreements with Israel and ally with Israel against Iran. Now, the Iranian clock is ticking. People are not talking about this enough, but the Iranians are on a verge of having the basic capability to have nuclear weapons, and there will need to be a decision in the next coming months what to do with this. And I think that the sanctions are not working fast enough, and something needs to be done, or an overt or a covert attack on the military installations, on the nuclear installations of Iran. And this is why this coalition, this is why Trump is pushing forward this coalition. The Iranian issue is the main issue that is bothering at the moment the US president. Of course, this gives him also a lot of points at home, and he thinks, of course, that it will help him in the elections to have peace accords and so on. But it's also really, really important regarding the Iranian issue. So is Israel, America, all these Sunni Arab states are very worried about Iran and are trying to build this coalition now. This is one thing. The other thing is that Netanyahu has been working for 3 years with President Trump on what they call the deal of the century, and they want to, of course, bring a new idea of how to solve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And I think that the way they are dealt with it is very good. I think the ideas that Trump and Netanyahu worked on can be very, very good. I will try to, can I share a map?
Sure, try.
Okay, so I will share a map and we'll talk about a bit about the plan and what's going on here in Israel.
Very good.
This, one moment. Okay, can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. So basically talking about, first of all, about Israel and a bit of proportions. When we talk about the land of Israel, we need to understand that we're talking about a very, very small area from the sea, from Tel Aviv, all the way to the Dead Sea, to our eastern border. It's only 70 kilometers. That's it. That's Israel. Now, the heart of Israel is the mountains of Judea and Samaria. This is most of the area. It's only 15 kilometers of the coastal area of the big cities around the coast, and about 15 kilometers of the Jordan Valley. And that's it. Israel is the mountains. And looking at history and looking at the way military should look at it, the entity that controls the mountains controls Israel. There is no way to control Israel without full control of the mountains. And today we have two kinds of solutions, so-called, and two basic ideas. One idea says, look, and this is the way the left in Israel and the generals in the left look at it. They say, okay, there are all these Palestinians living in Judea and Samaria, and the brown areas is the cities like Jenin, Tulkarem, or Hebron, and Ramallah, and so on. And the yellow areas is the villages, the smaller villages. This is the Palestinian areas. The blue area is the Israeli area, under Israeli control. All that, the yellow and brown is the Palestinian Authority area. So they say, okay, all these Palestinians, we don't want to see them. We don't want to mix with them. We want full separation. Now, full separation means withdrawing all the way to what is known as the Green Line or the 49th Armistice Line, or some call it the 67 line, the line before the War of 67. And this would leave Israel, first of all, only with 15 kilometers. Israel in 50 years will have more than 30 million people living in Israel. Where will they live? There's no area. The other thing is that from a military point of view, without the mountains and without the Jordan Valley, there is no existence to Israel. Israel cannot exist. Israel cannot defend itself from the Green Line. Because first of all, if the Jordan Valley is open, millions of people will pour into Judea and Samaria, and there is no way we can deal with this. And if we don't control the Palestinian areas here, then it will become Gaza. They can produce missiles, rockets, everything, and from the mountains they control everything. From here you see everything. There is no way the IDF can deal with such a situation. Now, how do they sell this plan? They say, listen, we'll leave the IDF for 10 years in the Jordan Valley and maybe in some areas here. And you say, okay, and what exactly is supposed to happen after 10 years? What is going to change? There is no answer to that. Like, hey, everything will be okay. You know, we'll sign the peace accord and the Arabs will defend us and maybe international forces will defend us. And this is completely against any common sense, against any military profession, and against the basic Zionistic idea that the people of Israel, the Jewish people, will never, ever be dependent again on somebody else in order to defend them. We will always defend ourselves. So Trump's plan basically recognizes this, and therefore Trump's plan says that Israel will apply its sovereignty over all these blue areas here, which are the Jordan Valley. So the first thing it says, we will be able to live in a defensible border that will disconnect us from all the Middle East. We'll have this, look how small Israel is, we'll have this, the eastern border, and nothing from the Middle East will be able to go inside this small area. This is one thing. The other thing that the plan says is that Israel will retain full security control in all of Judea and Samaria, and this control is based on the fact that all the Jewish towns remain, and we apply sovereignty over them. Now, the real security in Judea and Samaria, it's first and foremost the towns, not the military, because it's the presence of the towns that create the security. It's the people in the towns that wake up in the morning, drive in the major roads, and the fact there is all the time people driving and moving around and so on. This is what creates the ability to hold the ground. Without this, the IDF cannot be effective. So this understanding in Trump's plan is crucial. It's very, very important. And it actually promises that we will be able to control the area. Now, there are things about the plan that the Israeli people don't like, or many don't like, and it's the fact that in Trump's plan, they want to give the Palestinians more land in this area. There's a lot of issues about it, but it's not an existential threat. It's not a problem that is terrible in the military sense. It has other problems, but it's not the military issue that is the main issue here. Now, we think as a movement that when talking about national security, one of our prominent generals wrote a book that says that it's called What is National About National Security? And it's a very clever thing to say because national security is not a technical thing. National security derives its ideas from the nationalistic ideas. So we think that the Zionistic ideas and also the Jewish heritage is crucial for national security. If we leave if we leave places like Bethel, which have historical meaning, or Har Bracha, and so on, or the tomb of our forefathers, how can we explain to ourselves why we are here? What are we fighting for? This is not another New York or Manhattan. We are here because this is the religious and historical places of the Jewish people. And if we don't maintain them, and we're not sovereign over them, we won't be able to explain to the next generations why we should be here. So I think that also in this sense, the fact that all the important places, including of course Jerusalem, are in Israeli sovereign hands, this is very, very meaningful talking about Trump's plan. Now, at the moment, since they are dealing with these peace agreements, they say they are suspending sovereignty. We are very worried about that, and we hope that the issue will go back as soon as possible and will be dealt with. We're talking to all the ministers in Israel, we're talking to the administration and so on to make sure that they understand that this is much more crucial than any peace agreement with an Arab country. And we're pushing forward very hard to make sure that, that this happens. So this is the situation, and I would be happy at this stage to answer questions and have a talk about it.
Sure. Thanks a lot for the introduction, and thanks for your service to the IDF and to Israel. You were saying that because people live in the area and they move around, that creates security. Could you expand on that? Because in the Norwegian way of thinking, at least the mainstream way of thinking, we would tend to think that it's actually the other way around, that it will be it complicates the security work that actually Israelis live in an environment with enemies around.
Well, there is two issues about this. First of all, an army cannot be for a long time in a place where the country is not sovereign or there is no towns. I mean, the IDF is Israeli Defense Forces. They are supposed to defend Israeli citizens. They are supposed to be along Israeli borders. So the first thing you should ask yourself is, what are the defensible borders, and what, from a national security perspective, or even, you know, visionary perspective, the country, what are the borders that the country can live in for a long period of time? I think that a country that exists 4,000 years, a nation that exists 4,000 years, should be able to look at least 1,000 years ahead. And I'm telling you that 1,000 years ahead, the minimum that the Jewish people need to be viable and to be able to defend themselves is the area of the Jordan Valley and the big parts of the mountains of Judea and Samaria, where they can evolve and defend themselves. So if you understand that, then you understand where you have to build a population and where you have to build towns. And towns have a huge, huge effect on security. They help security, because the more massive presence you have of Jewish people, the easier it is for the military to control. Because at the end of the day, if you don't have towns, I'll give you an example. I'll share the map and I'll try to give a simple example. If I want to drive today from what's called today Junction Morasha, in this area where Route 5 goes, and I want to drive today from here to here, it's something like 1 hour drive. Today I take my car, one person alone, and I drive along this road. I won't see, probably, maybe I'll see one military jeep or something like that, but I see hundreds of Israeli cars moving back and forth this route. And this 100 of cars that can detect if something happens, many of them, of course, carry guns and so on, they are the ones who are keeping this road open. Now, if we withdraw the people from here, to move from here to here would take 2 days with probably 2 or 3 armored brigades. Because once you create vacuum here, then all this road will become IEDs, bombs, landmines, anti-tank missiles, and so on. And suddenly, this is war. So today, it's all the time open, and without towns, it's full-scale war. The army cannot control this vast area without towns. Towns are also the bases of where the military posts are. They are attached to the towns. They rely on the logistic of the town, and so on. This is part of the infrastructure. Now, what I'm saying here is classic Zionistic way of looking at things. Ben-Gurion, from day one, said the real security in Israel is towns, it's civilians. And this is why they build all the towns around the borders. So this is the importance of towns. And if we want to look at this is, by the way, how from Judea and Samaria you see Tel Aviv. So if we are not here, if the enemy controls this area, this is how they see Tel Aviv. It's crazy from a military point of view. It's impossible to deal with such a situation. Look at this. This is from Judea and Samaria, right? And this is what they want to make Israel. This, 15 kilometers. This is not viable. You can see the planes, how easy you can shoot a plane, or how easily you see the airport. And today, you know, Gaza, for example, Gaza from here to the sea is 5 kilometers. That's it. To cross these 5 kilometers today, when the army is not anymore inside this area, this is full-scale war with tens of thousands of rockets that will be shot on Israel. This is what living the area created here. Now we cannot have another Gaza in Judea and Samaria. Another Gaza in Judea and Samaria, there is no Israel. That's it.
Thanks a lot. The next question is from Rolf, please. And after that, Tobias.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Thank you for your introduction. And we're very concerned about the security. We have had the group being very active, talking and writing in the papers about the question about the territories, the annexation plan, San Remo, etc., etc., etc. But looking at your map, now, if you get the annexation of the whole Judea and Samaria, what would be the citizenship of the Arabs living in the area? Because the question about secondary citizens or apartheid or whatever you call it is very, very valid. Would that area now be annexed as part of Israel proper, or would the brown areas be called the state of Palestine or self?
You're asking these questions in relation to Trump's plan?
Yeah.
Okay. In Trump's plan, 0 Palestinians are annexed. Trump's plan is talking about applying sovereignty in all the areas that don't have Palestinians. So if we go back for a moment to the map, I'm talking about the blue areas. So he's talking about the Jordan Valley without Jericho, okay? All this blue area, all this, and without applying sovereignty over Jericho. So no Palestinians here. And he's talking about each and every town specifically applying Israeli sovereignty. It's applying sovereignty over the people, not in this area, not really the area. So basically the Palestinians in stage 1 they remain exactly as they are today. They control their own areas, they control their own people. And talking about a Palestinian state, it needs to be understood. When we talk about a Palestinian state, and the Americans talk about a Palestinian state, we're talking about a state like Luxembourg. We're talking about a state maybe like the Vatican. A state that is a state. It has a government, it has its civilians and so on, but it's demilitarized, and the overall responsibility of security is of another state. Just as I mentioned, it's very similar to Luxembourg, for example. So there is one thing that in Israel, I would say 98% of the people agree, and all the political parties in Israel agree. None of us want to annex Palestinians. None of us want to add to Israel 2 million Palestinian citizens, and none of us want to be responsible for Palestinians without letting them have citizenship. They need their own citizenship. Everybody in Israel almost agrees that this is the best thing to do. And now it's exactly how to do it. Now, the issue is very simple. We have two big issues. One is security. It's a rigid issue. It's not something you can play with. And this is something that we have to meet the demands we need. We need the Jordan Valley. We need full security control in Judea and Samaria. For that, we need the towns. The other thing is Palestinian state. This is a very, very, very flexible issue. It has a lot of solutions. There is a lot of examples in the world how to find a solution that they will have a state, but it will meet the security requirements Israel needs. And this is where we need to go to.
Tobias?
Please.
Yes, well, thank you. My question is, what are your thoughts on China and Iran's newly trade and military partnership? Do you think that it will be like China's deal with Pakistan? Or do you think that it will have more teeth, that it's not just a lot of fancy words and empty and a lot of promises? Or do you think that China will follow through and basically undo the American sanctions?
I would like to talk about China from an Israeli point of view. Well, first of all, the Americans are very, very unhappy that Israel is doing projects with the Chinese. The Chinese issue for the Israelis is very sensitive now. The Americans expect Israel to assist American economy and not Chinese economy. And the tension between the Americans and the Chinese are affecting Israel, and Israel needs to be very, very careful when it handles itself with the Chinese. Especially now that we are very dependent on decisions that are taken in the White House. Now, the fact that the Chinese are, let's say, flirting with the Iranians, there is no better excuse to get distant from them. They are allying with the Iranians. Many people in Iran don't like it. On the other hand, the Iranians are having huge, huge economical problems, and they need assistance, and nobody is backing them. So the Chinese are taking advantage of that and trying to expand their influence over the Middle East. And there is not much we can do about it, but the right thing for Israel to do is distance herself a bit from the Chinese government and strengthen our alliance with the US.
I have a question regarding the Palestinian population in the West Bank or Judea and Samaria. So there are official statistics from the PA, and there are demographers on the right wing political landscape in Israel, putting the figures of the number of Palestinians far, far lower than the official figures. Do the IDF or any other institution in Israel have exact knowledge about the number of Palestinian citizens there, or do you have a pretty exact, or do you have a strong facts about the exact number?
Well, since you cannot rely on the Palestinian numbers, it's very, very hard to say. I would say this. It's obvious that there is something between 1.5 million to 2.5 million. Maybe it will come as a surprise, but I think that it's not that critical what the number is, because even if it's 1.5 million, I would say we have no interest in annexing them. We wouldn't bring to Israel now 1.5 million Palestinian citizens. So the numbers in this sense, they were important to people who were saying, oh, listen, we need to think about a one-state solution. We need to think about overthrowing the Palestinian Authority, and there is not so many Palestinians, we'll annex them. Well, 1.5 million is a lot. And even if it's 1.5 million, it's a lot. So I would say that it's less important, but I think, and I will say something about that, there are Palestinians, and it's the same as all the Muslim world. Many of them are living. Many of them want to go to Europe, just as all other Muslims do. Talking about the Palestinians that are attached to the land, the only land they are attached to is Berlin. They are not so attached to the land as people tend to think. In Gaza, their own polls show that 70% of the people, if they get a chance to leave Gaza, they will leave and they won't go back, because the situation there is terrible. And people want a standard of living, and they would be happy to start a life somewhere else. Also, talking about demography, in the last few years, the Jewish families have grown bigger than the Muslim families all over the Middle East, but also talking about the Palestinians. Jews are bringing more and more children, and not necessarily the religious ones. Also, the non-religious Jews bring more kids. And in the Palestinian Authority and also in the Israeli Arabs, women are undergoing a process of going to university and careers. It didn't happen before. And so the number of children they're having is getting lower and lower. Just to have a sense of numbers, I talked, for example, about Iran. In Iran, 10, 20 years ago, it was like 7, 8 kids per family. Now it's European numbers, 1.7. It's amazing. Iran is shrinking. And not only Iran, and for many reasons. By the way, one of the reasons is that because you know whether it's a boy or a girl, when they have girls, they have abortions. So if in Israel, for example, there is 50.5 girls and 49.5 boys, in some countries now it's like 60, 70 boys, 30 girls. There is no girls. So one of the ways they're convincing people to do jihad, to attack, to move from one place to another, is conquering areas and getting women, because they're lacking women. So something that used to happen maybe 3,000 years ago, but it's happening now.
Thanks. Another question. So we will often hear in Norway, or the enemies of Israel have said for years that Israel building in the settlements have destroyed the a viable Palestinian state, there won't be a two-state solution, and they are saying that the Trump map also closes the opportunity for the Palestinians to have a sustainable state where the territory is connected. But when I look at the Trump map, there are connections all over the place within the Palestinian dedicated area. So maybe you could comment on that.
There is there is different things that you talked about. First of all, let's talk about freedom of movement. Maybe this is the most important thing. There is no problem technically, even today, even if Israel applies its sovereignty over all of the areas C, 60% of Judea and Samaria, there is no problem creating a net of roads, of tunnels, of bridges that connect every single Palestinian town or a city one to the other. This is simple, no problem. It can be done today. It doesn't happen, by the way, because the Israelis and the Palestinians cannot get to agree to build together a subway, let's say, from the Jenin all the way to Hebron, because there is not one person responsible for all this area. This is why, by the way, overall Israeli sovereignty would be very effective also for the Palestinians. But this is not the situation now. The other thing is a viable state. There is no scenario that Israel can exist and the Palestinians can have a fully sovereign state in Judea and Samaria, which means all of Judea and Samaria and the Jordan Valley, and kicking out hundreds of thousands of Jews from their homes. There is no such scenario, and it will never happen. So we have to understand again that we are talking about a Palestinian state, we're talking about a Luxembourg. Now, I myself, and this is maybe in another occasion, if you want to create the next Oslo, I will be happy to present to you next time my plan and some of my colleagues' plan how to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There are solutions for a viable Palestinian state, but not in Judea and Samaria. They can continue living as they are in Judea and Samaria, but if we want a viable Palestinian state, the only place that it can happen, you know, this area down here, this is Gaza. This is, of course, Israel and Judea and Samaria. This is the Dead Sea, this is Jordan. Look at how dense is the population in Israel now with Judea and Samaria. Look at Egypt that continues to build its civilization as in ancient times along the Nile. And look at this is the Sinai Peninsula. This is the potential. So if we would take Gaza, for example, and enlarge it into a portion of the Sinai Peninsula, we could create a viable, contiguous, free, completely sovereign Palestinian state. But this needs an international agreement, and of course needs Egypt to agree to lease part of the land here in the Sinai Peninsula. But this is a viable solution. This is really having a Palestinian state that is completely free and viable, and the Israeli state, one beside the other, not one inside the other. So really what I'm saying is that we need to depart from the paradigm of a Palestinian state in Judea and Samaria and start thinking about Gaza, that is actually a state today, but needs to be enlarged, because I don't see anything viable here. You know, people tend to ask a lot of questions about Judea and Samaria, but they forget that 2 million Palestinians live here, but also 2 million Palestinians live in this small area. And I don't understand how people can feel good about themselves when they lock up 2 million Palestinians in an area with the width of 5 kilometers forever. Doesn't sound very viable to me. So when the British that controlled all the Middle East decide to give the Arabs all these states, and instead of giving the Jewish people all the states, they also try to put 2 states inside an area with the width of 70 kilometers. This is not viable. If we want to be viable, we need most of the area for ourselves. If they want to be viable, they need most of the area for themselves. And we're not going to cede the only Jewish state to them. So basically, if you ask me, if we don't bring more land to the discussion, there is no viable solution for the Palestinians for a completely free state.
Thanks. Next question from Bengt Ove Norgård.
Hello, you can hear me?
Yes, very well.
Yes, first I have to say thank you very much for a highly interesting lecture. In Norway, the Norwegian mass media has been giving a lot of attention to the organization called Breaking the Silence. And can you tell us how influential is this organization among your military colleagues?
This organization, I would say the vast majority of Israelis look at this organization as a radical left organization. Some even consider themselves as kind of traitors. This organization is not here to do anything good. They are not operating because of values. They're operating to undermine Israel and the IDF. We caught them not long ago collecting intelligence from reserve soldiers about military positions and about weapons and so on. And we, together with another organization, filed to the Supreme Court asking that this will be taken care of. Again, it's considered a very radical organization and not any organization that in Israel somebody takes seriously. But of course, for people who want to be against Israel or hear bad things outside of Israel, so of course they tend to listen to people like that.
So among your colleagues, can you say that one small percentage or how many, how much influence do they have on your military colleagues?
I would say almost zero.
Okay, thank you. That's good to hear.
I don't see any more questions from the audience. I just want to close by giving thanks for your presentation. Thanks for joining us. We next Wednesday we will be joined by the Israeli ambassador to Copenhagen, to Denmark, we were really happy that you could kick off our Zoom events for this last part of the year, and we wish you all the best in your work. And I will stop the recording now and say some few words in Norwegian. So, litraot.
Thank you. And
Shabbat shalom.
I posted before our website. So if we post a lot of articles and so on, so you can read, follow, and we have many specialists. Anytime you want to discuss things, we're more than happy to do so.
Thanks.